Hope everyone is ready for our next session. And the next session deals with return policies. And to share this session, we have Eeva Nykänen, who is the Chief Specialist at the National Institute for Health and Welfare in Finland. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm also member of the board of NIM, so have to use this opportunity to advertise our work. So thank you very much for inviting me here to chair this enormously interesting session, a very topical session. So we have, as we are all very well aware of, we have witnessed a considerable increase in the number of asylum seekers, and also the number of persons whose applications have been rejected and who are being removed, who are being offered the opportunity to leave voluntarily, or who are being removed with force. And this, of course, raises big questions. We are faced with the question of how to manage the removal process in a due manner which takes sufficiently into account the interests of all the parties involved. So the dignity and the fundamental rights of the person to be removed, the interest of the removing state, but also the interest of the place of the state where the person is being removed to, or where he's returned to. So there are many pressing, important questions with fundamental importance which we are going to address in this panel. I have the pleasure to introduce May-Len Skilbrei, sorry about the pronunciation. So she's a professor of criminology at the University of Oslo and a former Fafo employee. She's currently heading a research project which is called Transnationalism from Above and Below, Migration Management and How Migrants Manage. And this is funded by the Research Council of Norway, and she has extensive experience of research on migration issues. So,
thank you. I'll go over here and see if I find my PowerPoint. It was very bright. Attacked here, but okay. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present my work here today and to kind of bring us to a different area of migration control or management. Borrowed from the corporate world, the term management in migration management suggests control and efficiency and glosses over some possible conflicts that exist within government, between states and migrants. One way to unpack this is to take a closer look at one of its components and to ask what roles it is intended to fill and what that says about the migration system and the society it is a part of. Contemporary policies to include and exclude migrants range from brute force to negotiation and contract making. They have different functions in the overall migration policy paradigm. It is interesting to investigate this range of approaches and how they relate to how governments approach also other populations. Is the power to govern national populations dependent on the modality of power exerted over migrants? In 2015 and the first months of 2016, Europe saw record high numbers of arrival of migrants. And I'm using the term migrants here to encompass both those who will apply for asylum and those who will not. And both those who will receive protection and those who will not. Under the assumption, under the starting assumption that refugees are also migrants. In lieu of the attention to arrival in the last 15 months, migration policies has been scrutinized and revised throughout Europe. While there is much to be said about what factors in sending countries produces migration, how migration is organized and exploited, the scope of arrivals and the way migrants are received, and the quality of asylum adjudications, what happens after for those who are not granted asylum is not necessarily debated that often. even though it is immensely important to many people. A considerable share of the migrants that has arrived in Europe in the last 15 months will be rejected by the host state and legally obliged to leave. And many of them will contest the power of the state to put that decision into effect. We're talking about rejecting asylum seekers, overstayers, but also irregulars who never applied for asylum. One instrument applied by European governments to make sure that they leave are programs for assisted return. I'm not talking about Dublin transfers here today. Several has researched assisted return programs, both in Norway and in other European countries. But I think it's important to expand our thinking about assisted return to encompass its relationships with other instruments of migration management and its larger context, of which bilateral and multilateral agreements and relationships are particularly important. I therefore appreciate how this conference opened up for bridging various concerns to do with the control of migration. It opens up for broader reflections about what the return is and can be. We are now turning from arrivals to returns, from entry to exit. It has already been a long day with many presentations that has been presented and kind of encompassing the kind of full scope of a process, a process that is not linear, but instead for many is cyclical, leaving, arriving, staying, leaving, arriving, staying, from, to, and in different geographical locations. Earlier today, you've heard about the increasing use of enforced removals or deportations, 7,825 in 2015. Deportations or enforced returns is a tool in itself as a very direct display of state power over the territory and as an incentive to get migrants to choose to instead leave Norway or another European country on their own accord, or with the help of a program for assisted return. Enforced returns are difficult and expensive, and often raise critique from civil society and the international community. And this makes programs for assisted return and policy instruments resting on the seeming compliance of migrants more attractive to European governments. This means that the more critique for brute force, the more will be invested in making migrants themselves take the responsibility. The relationship between various instruments and between them and the public opinion is important. So assisted return is the kind of migration management that I am currently interested in. It is still often many places and previously in Norway framed as voluntary return. And it is a particularly good example of the nature in the contemporary of how states govern migration, even though it's not among the best known and not among the most debated. It's still very typical. For states, the execution of migration management ideally does not create dramatic scenarios and tarnishes their reputation as humanitarian and modern. And ideally, they do not entice criticism from national and international civil society. And as I stated, this means that we perhaps will see a further push towards making migrants making the decision themselves. Currently, they are not doing so to the extent that European governments would prefer. Schemes for assisted return are not maximally exploited. In Norway, between 1,000 and 2,000 travels leaves every year, 1,016 in 2015. And based on the figures for 2015, based on the figures for 2016 so far, it looks like there might be more assisted return this year. But this is much lower than the aim set by the Norwegian government. And so I believe that we have only seen the start of this and that this might be a more important instrument. Of course, there are some frameworks for enacting return, assisted return, and the relationship between assisted and enforced. These are some of the EU documents that regulate what can be done. So since 2010, Norway are under obligation to follow the EU Return Directive. My job is not to kind of understand the full scope of these regulations and the kind of law in that, but instead to understand how they are framed, how returns are framed in this, and how developments over time says something about what kind of instrument return is in this society. As I said, there is a priority towards return in European policy making, and there are some changes that are being made. I'm going to return a bit to this, but just to show what are the standards, because while the EU Return Directive set the framework, more recent development has given content or specified more clearly the priorities. So the European Agenda on Migration places the return in the wider context of the migration system. And the partnership framework of this year further emphasize the role of return. And as we heard earlier today, while the contemporary or the recent migration paradigm is one which focuses on deterrence, it is still easy to see in these EU documents how deterrence through return is still very much alive. And we also heard that in the Prime Minister Erna Solberg talk earlier. Okay, I think I skipped, but yes, and in the Norwegian, of course, Norway is bound by the Return Directive, but it is also a clear aim of the Norwegian government. It's among the top 3 goals of the current government. The first one is to receive fewer asylum seekers that are not eligible for protection. These are from the web page of the Norwegian government. The second is to enact return faster, among other things, under the assumption that it prevents arrivals. And the third, to establish the identity of applicants earlier in the process. And here we see that in placing it on the kind of among only 3 issues to be prioritized, return is not disappearing anytime soon. In this, there lies assumptions about the relationship between assisted return and enforced returns. And this has been an area for research in many European countries for a long time, how the relationship is between the possibility of being subjected to enforced return on promoting a choice to participate in a program for assisted return. But equally assumed that return, both enforced and assisted, might play a role in deterring migrants from ever leaving, emphasizing that the knowledge that Europe prioritizes return is something that will stop people from leaving. So to understand the full role of return in contemporary migration management, we need to look beyond the, for example, in Norway, 1,000 to 2,000 people that are part of the program for assisted return, and instead look at how it fits into the greater scheme of things. This is just a reference to an article recently based on an interview with the Minister of Immigration, Sylvi Listhaug. And she recently proclaimed the continued and strengthened priority of return to manage migration in Norway. Quote, "We would like as many as possible to return voluntarily if they do not have the right to legal stay in Norway. And if they do not choose, and the argument being that if they do not choose to leave, the enforced deportation will be the alternative. And this evidence why civil society researchers and governments move away from calling this voluntary return, because the underlying threat of deportation is too real for voluntariness to be a reality. And Erlend Paasche's paper later will also touch upon issues to do with the practicalities of return in migrants' lives. Return policies offer a practical framework, but also have more symbolic functions as something that sends a signal by how they integrate and normalize the question of return in the whole asylum process. This is explicated further in the interview with Listhaug. Quote, But there is a need to keep the pressure up, especially to send a strong signal that Norway is not a suitable country to travel to if you do not have a legitimate asylum claim. Returning is also about upholding the legitimacy of the Asylum Institute. End of quote. So it's the whole legitimacy of the Asylum Institute that is at stake. And while enforced returns are often criticized, this stands now out as not playing not only out as the only solution if people do not want to leave on their own. As I mentioned, the Norwegian government is not alone in arguing this, that return is an important deterrent factor. This is at the core of several EU statements and agreements. This is from the European Agenda on Migration of last year, where it lists return as part of the aim to reduce incentives for irregular migration. So the deterring effect is definitely part of this. Quote, one of the incentives for irregular migrants is the knowledge that the EU return system meant to return irregular migrants or those whose asylum application are refused works imperfectly, end of quote. While politicians often take particular causal effects, assume particular causal effects between the policy they make and the actions of others for granted, researchers are not necessarily certain about the dynamics between assisted and enforced return and the relationship between return and migration in the first hand. Also, among other things, because research points to how problems in assuming that migrants make use of information about European migration policies in their own decision-making in the way that European policymakers appear to assume. As a researcher, I need to state that what we almost always state, that we need to research this further. And this is something that I, together with others, will continue to investigate. This is kind of a report from an ongoing project. So to advertise a bit, we are performing, as Eeva mentioned, a larger project on return policies in their larger context, exploring the details of return systems and the contextualize the legal frameworks of them. We aim to understand what kinds of governance goes into the enactment of return, both in the making of BE and multilateral agreements and readmission agreements, and in negotiating return with migrants. And this points to also the greater context of return policies that points outside of it as a part of migration management. It also needs to be seen in a complex relationship with development aid policies and with foreign policy. So the project will then go on to investigate both those contracts and the kind of negotiations behind them, but also the negotiations with individual migrants to make them change their minds. And at the end, trying then to understand how migrants understand and make use of European return policies and how policymakers understand migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let me introduce Dr. Erlend Paasche, yes, who is specialized in migration studies and has been working on the topic of return migration at the Peace Research Institute Oslo since 2010. He also has experience in more sort of practical aspects of this issue. He has been working as a consultant and taking part in governmentally commissioned evaluations of assisted return from Norway to Iraq, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kosovo, and Nigeria. Over the next 3 years, he will be a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Criminology and Sociology of Law, University of Oslo, working in the project referred to by May-Len, and also as a visiting fellow at the Oxford University. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Fafo for inviting me, and thanks to the audience for still staying awake after the lunch. I'll be talking about assisted return, and you can see from the subtitle already that I'm talking about assisted return from a kind of migrant-centric perspective, or at least that's what I'm trying to explore. Why not trust a host state? May-Len touched upon this, but you see that between 25 and 60% of asylum applications that have been so-called realitetsbehandlet in Norway between 2005 and 2015 were rejected. And as May-Len said, this is a group that doesn't get a lot of attention, at least not relative to the attention that those who are granted asylum get. But it's quite a large population, and it's a stated policy objective to make as high as number of this group as possible return through assisted return. That's partly because assisted return is seen as a win-win situation, both for the host state and for migrants. For the host state, it's considered more humane, less controversial, more politically acceptable, more cost-effective than forced return, and it also legitimizes forced return, or it's used to legitimize forced return. For migrants, you could say that it allows for return with dignity. Like, there are empirical studies showing that some returnees actually appreciate the chance to go back, like in the form of assisted return. It also allows for planning ahead. You can think ahead. It's not as if the police suddenly comes to your door and throws you out. It also offers incentives, either in the form of a cash grant or in-kind assistance. And it can allow for remigration. So the paradox then, if this is a win-win situation, is why are there so few rejected asylum seekers who actually opt for assisted return? I'm talking in terms of absolute numbers. The numbers can be high in Norway relative to other countries. But as you see here, at least in absolute numbers, the red graph shows the number of asylum applications in Norway over the last decade. And the blue line shows the number of rejected asylum seekers, and the green line shows the number of applications for assisted return. Now, if you think that that graph, the green graph, seems quite small, it's actually half of that. It's half of those numbers that actually leave through assisted return, because 10% of those 10% of the applications for assisted return are rejected by the police, and 40% of the applications are withdrawn by the migrant. So the number of assisted return is relatively small. Now, you could think of that as a paradox, or you could think of it as quite easily explicable. I think it's often what seems as a paradox to some of us might be less paradoxical if you look at the migrants' kind of social universe and the kind of the perspective of migrants. And in that perspective, I think something that we easily miss out on, but that they do not miss out on, is the role of trust. Like, as an as a rejected asylum seeker applying for assisted return, there's a great deal of trust in the host state involved. Like, he or she needs to trust the host state to deliver on its promise. So if you look at the 4 stages of assisted return, you could think of the sign-up as the kind of starting point. This is when you go to the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and say that you would like to go back through assisted return. Then there's supposed to be some kind of counseling and follow-up prior to the departure. And then there's transportation. The flight is covered, of course, as opposed to forced return. And finally, upon arrival in the country of origin, you're supposed to get post-return assistance. Now, the state is trusted before assisted return is enacted. But the state's trustworthiness in terms of whether or not the assistance will be provided, in what way, in shape and form, is not established for the individual migrant until after the return is a fact. And I think this might seem banal, but it's easily forgotten by us because we have such a tremendous amount of trust in our public institutions. But there are a number of reasons, I think, why for the potential benefactor or for the target group or whatever you want to call for the rejected asylum seeker, this might look very much like buying a pig in a poke or a cat in a sack. It's like you register for something that you do not actually know what is in detail. And in this sense, the paradox kind of dissolves because, why? Because buying a pig in a poke requires trust. And the decision to return is based on trust in the state's various assurances. First of all, after your application has been rejected, the host state tells you that that you will not be granted asylum. But how can you really know for sure? How can you really know that you can trust the host state on its word? Maybe there's a miracle, maybe there's a change in asylum policy, maybe you get to know someone who you think might help you, all these questions that rejected asylum seekers face. And secondly, the host state says that either you go through assisted return with the IOM or you will be deported. This is a credible threat, supposedly, but actually deportation, at least to the country of origin, happens quite rarely. And you could argue that deportation to a Dublin country or to another country in Europe might have less of a deterring effect than deportation to the origin country. And then finally, and the question that I'm most interested in here, the host state promises that post-return assistance will be delivered. But what if it won't be delivered? I think there are several reasons why migrants might not trust the host state. First of all, from the perspective of a rejected asylum seeker, he, and I use the word he because there are a lot of male asylum seekers, is to trust the state that distrusts him and seeks to return him. So, for many asylum seekers, to not get asylum is to not be believed, so not to be trusted that you have a legitimate claim for protection. And of course, a state that seeks to return you has other strategic interests than you do because your strategic interest is to stay, right? So this is the state that you're supposed to trust. Now, secondly, a lot of asylum seekers come from what you could call a low trust state, where trust in the state is low, in public institutions is low. Erna Solberg Prime Minister Erna Solberg actually raised this point earlier on in her keynote speech that, and I think I'm quoting her verbatim now, if there's one dimension in which Norway stands out, it's in terms of high confidence in public institutions. But in a lot of the kind of war-affected and weak and failing states that asylum seekers come from, that's not the case. So you might think that they bring this kind of distrust to public institutions, to Norway, at least to some extent. Conversely, you could also argue that even if you don't buy into that premise, the rejected asylum seekers would return to a state where corruption is endemic, which is true for a great deal of sending countries for asylum seekers. And in this kind of endemically corrupt setting, you're supposed to get outsourced assistance from a third party contracted by the host state. So not Norway directly, but the third party, the IOM. And finally, another reason to potentially distrust the host state is that you're unable to sanction an eventual violation of trust. Like the power asymmetry already like in Norway between an asylum seeker and the state is tremendous, but upon return, you're not even part of national jurisdiction anymore, right? So you're unable to sanction, but also actually like pretty much unable to report an eventual violation of trust. And who's even responsible if trust is violated? Like, is it Norway? Is it the lawyer or caseworker or social worker or reception staff and reception center employee that is responsible? Is it the International Organization for Migration that operated in Oslo, or is it the IOM in the state of origin? And if you in a different perspective, why should Norway be responsible for a non-citizen who is now returned to a state where he or she is a citizen? So the lines of of responsibility become muddled in that perspective, which is another reason not to trust the host state. Now, you could put this more bluntly as well. I've taken part, as Eeva said, I've taken part in a lot of governmentally commissioned evaluation studies of assisted return, and one of the things we found was that there are transnational rumors of corruption. There are transnational rumors that that those who sign up for assisted return don't get what they're promised, or at least that they feel this and that they report this. We found that in the evaluation of assisted return to Iraq, and we found that more recently with May-Len Skilbrei and Sine Plambek, that in the context of Nigeria, that there were transnational rumors that you wouldn't get what you promised. And very poignantly in Afghanistan, in the study of assisted return to it was a comparative study that was published earlier this year. We found strong suspicions of corruption in IOM Kabul, and a subsequent study by Deloitte kind of confirmed this. Yeah. So on that note, I thank you. And,
Okay, thank you very much. And now we have still one more person to present. So let me introduce Kristian Kindt. He's a sociologist by training and has worked as a researcher at the Fafo since 2014. And he has been involved in projects dealing with political and social issues in the Middle East, polarization in Ukraine, and migration and integration related issues in Norway. But now he's not going to give a formal presentation, but rather something else, but I'll let you yourself explain the situation and the reasons for that.
Yeah, thank you. I have a very exciting PowerPoint presentation that I would love to share with you, but it's based on a project that Vigdis Vevstad, Silje Sønstrebråten, and I have been doing for the Ministry of Justice about the effectiveness of Norwegian readmission agreements. And we were supposed to present some preliminary findings from that study, which is going to be published in about a month. Unfortunately, the Ministry has asked us not to reveal these preliminary findings before they are published findings. So we will respect that, and I will, but still, so that's why I'm sitting and not standing. So how I operationalize that instruction. But I would still like to say something about readmission agreements and what we know about them based on previous research that has been done. And I promise, I don't know if the official from the Ministry of Justice is still here, but I promise I won't say anything that we've found, only things that others have found. So, readmission agreements is a fascinating topic because, as May-Len and Erlend and also Erna Solberg said, I mean, this return to secure return is a key component in Norwegian migration policy. And so policymakers are looking for effective ways to secure both assisted returns, but also how to manage forced returns if assisted returns are not happening, as we see that they are not to such a large extent. And the readmission agreements is sort of put up there by politicians as a very effective tool. It's seen, it was written in the previous government, the Stoltenberg government's declaration that they would work to increase the number of readmission agreements. It's also part of the Erna Solberg's government sort of return policy, an important aspect to secure more readmission agreements. We have signed readmission agreements with now 31 countries, and the majority of those have been the last 10 years. And it's even when you hear politicians in interviews, I think it was Sveinung Rotevatn from the Liberal Party was interviewed this week, and he said, yeah, you know, there are many countries where we can't return asylum seekers because we don't have readmission agreements with every country, which sort of says something about many politicians think that this readmission agreement, if we only get that, if we have a readmission agreement with the country, then we can sort of forcibly return everyone. And yeah, so, and it's also, this is sort of not a right-wing project or anything, it's the Socialist Party also agrees that it's important to secure more readmission agreement. But the question is if they are actually working or not. Are they effective? Is it so that when you get a readmission agreement with a country, then everyone who has no right to stay here from that country is returned? And that is that's a question that we're looking into in this project. And it is, I would like to just demystify that sort of myth a bit, which is possible to do without going into our numbers specifically. Because first of all, it is in international law, every country are obliged to take their own citizens back. Like that's the principle in international law. So technically, the readmission agreements should not be necessary, right? You can only say, yeah, but you're supposed to take your citizens back, so just do it. But then that does not always happen. So the goal of this readmission agreement is sort of to formalize just a process of, okay, how can we deal with the forced returns? Who are the contact persons in this country? How should we go about it? What's the steps to sort of formalize this process of forced returns? But you do a lot of, I mean, Norway forcibly returns a lot of people to countries that we do not have a readmission agreement with. It's not like, it's not a precondition to return anyone to have a readmission agreement. So it's more like, it's a tool that, it's an agreement that can facilitate returns more easily, but it is not a prerequisite for return. And if we look at previous research into whether they've been effective or not, the findings are a bit mixed. The agreements that have been studied most are the agreements with Iraq and the agreement with Ethiopia. And with Iraq, we entered into an agreement in 2009. And previous research sort of points to that in the beginning you saw quite a sort of spike in the number of forced returns compared to the years before, but then the numbers went down again. But that it looks like, okay, maybe it was a moderate success, but with some challenges. And then Ethiopia has been widely sort of criticized from many angles, but also for not being effective at all. Research has shown that we have returned like under 10 people to Ethiopia by force after the readmission agreement in 2012. It's almost no one. So even though we have a readmission agreement with Ethiopia, it seems to not be working, at least in forced returns. And we can also, if you go into the website of UDI and you can see, okay, who is in reception centers and which are waiting to be returned. Like, okay, the people in reception centers that have gotten their final rejection of their application, where are they from? And there you see that quite a number of those, I think around 40% or something, last I checked, are from countries that we do have a readmission agreement with. So you have a lot of people in Norwegian reception centers from countries we have a readmission agreement with that are staying there and probably have been there for quite some time. So it seems, based on previous research, that it's not this sort of magic tool that we sometimes from the public debate can get the sense that it is. And then we can sort of ask, okay, so why is that the case? Why isn't it working if so well? And then I think first of all, it's quite a number, as May-Len and Erlend talked about, to return someone is not it's a complicated process. It's not just that you don't have the right to stay here, so go home. I mean, for example, your ID must check out. And the country that, like Iraq, if you're going to return to Iraq must sort of accept that, yes, this is an Iraqi citizen. And if you don't have the ID papers, and they don't trust the ID papers, or we don't trust their ID papers, then the return won't happen. And that can happen, no matter if you have an agreement with the country or not. Also, I mean, it can be you can have an agreement with a country where it's not safe to return. Like Afghanistan, for example. We've had an agreement with Afghanistan for quite some time, but it's been periods at least where the Norwegian government has seen that, you know, you can't return people to Afghanistan. And now it's a new controversy that the Norwegian government is returning to Afghanistan more than other European countries, and difference of interpretation. But still, its return can sort of be hindered by the fact that there is war in this country. And then it's not like the readmission agreements trump the non-refoulement principle that you're not supposed to return to a country where it's not safe. Also, it's more like issues, for example, we've seen several reports before about people who are escaping from reception centers in Norway. And if people escape or choose to leave from reception centers, and if they do, it's very difficult for the police, or it demands a lot of resources from the police to find them. So they can hide and sort of avoid return in that way. And it's not like the police necessarily uses more resources on the people from countries that we have a readmission agreement with. So people can sort of just not be there in the reception centers ready to be returned, which also hinders returns. So all these are factors that sort of can limit return, that have nothing to do, which are very important and have nothing to do with the readmission agreements. Then you can say, okay, there are some factors that the readmission agreement can affect. Like, for example, the way it can make this ID verification simpler. It can streamline the processes between Norway and this other country, so that it's sort of the process happens faster. And there are a couple of things that sort of feasibly might be affected, that might make return more easy, but still, no matter what, you won't solve the fundamental problem of return by readmission agreement. So my main point is just that in the political discussion of return policy, often both civil society and politicians point to these readmission agreements as key. But I think we should shift or realize that this is one tool in a sort of a complex sea of a lot of different tools that the Norwegian government uses for return. If you see now in the 2017 budget, for example, the Department of Justice, they're spending a lot of money on ID verification, for example. And that's also to increase return. And it's a lot of different measures that are much more politically controversial than these return agreements. So everyone sort of agrees that, okay, we have readmission agreements, and that's fine, and we can keep doing it, and it might sort of facilitate processes. But the discussion around return policy should not be focused. It's been perhaps a sort of over-focus on this tool compared to others. So it's sort of it's usually researchers, you know, they find this topic that no one thought about and show how important it is. But here it's more the other way around. that you know, it's everyone sees this as a very important tool. Well, we try to say that, yeah, you know, it's only a piece of paper. It's other things that needs to happen if you want to discuss or facilitate return. So that, I think I'll stop there before I say something I'm not supposed to say.
Okay. Thank you very much for your very informative non-presentation. And now we are all very much looking forward to the report, and we can
hope to see you all there.
Disclose the secret. It's very interesting. And now, when you take the microphone, I just use the opportunity of asking very quickly from Erlend. Do you think that it would be possible to build up the trust with the migrant in this situation? Because if you see that the lack of trust is kind of the crux of the issue, you cannot get this system functioning because there is no trust. But is it possible to somehow create the trust here?
Yeah, I think it's possible, but I think the standard answer, as we talked about before, like Norway has commissioned several studies of assisted return, and there is a bit of an established literature on how to gain that trust, how to kind of convince rejected asylum seekers to opt for assisted return. But I think a kind of an oft-repeated theme in that literature is that you have to provide good information. And I think what's missing is a bit like the acknowledgement that you can't just offer good information that is precise and accurate. You also have to like ensure the quality of the services provided upon return. And this is in a way more difficult. I mean, it's, as I said, like it's outside of Norwegian kind of jurisdiction. There's a little kind of popular demand for better services for returnees. I mean, that's not, you don't win elections on that rallying platform. And it's also a service that is offered by a third party, a non-state actor. So I think, in a way, building the trust is also partly about kind of monitoring, finding out what's going on the ground. Do people get what they are promised? And in this sense, Norway is doing. It's taking for me, it's taking a bit of a leadership position in Europe in doing this kind of generating insight into what happens after return.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now open the door. Can I ask you to introduce yourself? And
Yes,
also...
I'm still Trygve Nordby. I think this is important because for migration policies to work, a lot of components need to come together. One of the most important components of that is actually return. So any migration policy without a strong return component, you need borders to handle people at the border. You need border control. You need return to have the whole system function. Thing is, though, that if we go into what is return, it is as complicated because there are so many different partners. You have given us some insight. But return involves, first of all, a set of countries, not only country of origin, but these people are spread to all our countries, the Nordic countries plus many others. If these different countries, the countries where people stay, have different policies, we're played up against each other, we confuse the returnees, we confuse the country of origin. So I think we have to look at much more comprehensive ways of dealing with return policies. And I'll give you a very concrete example. And it's a Nordic example. After the Vietnam War, several 100,000 people were spread around the South Chinese Sea. And they were stuck because, the peace was 1975, 1989. Hundreds of thousands were still there, and the rest of the world said, no more, as we have started to say with other groups here, Afghans and others. So what did the UNHCR and many of the countries do? They created the Comprehensive Plan of Action, where they put together all the different components. And they didn't have like a Norwegian policy, an American policy, a Filipino policy. They had one comprehensive plan of action where all these actors played together. And interestingly enough, when it came to the most difficult part of the whole comprehensive plan of action, the unaccompanied minors, and we know that so well from our country now, the unaccompanied minors, we had several thousand registered unaccompanied minors in different countries. They had no other option but to go back to Vietnam. So what happened? Nordic NGOs came together with UNHCR. We would set up a Nordic Assistance to Return Vietnamese, NARV. It was led for many years of Tove, who is here now, from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thing is that we took back between 6,000 and 7,000 unaccompanied minors to Vietnam. Because people trusted us, they trusted the Nordics, they trusted the humanitarians. We did a lot of lobby work, not only in Brussels, but in Washington and elsewhere. And we said, we do have some humanitarian traditions. We will not leave these kids in limbo when they return. We spoke to families, we helped build up local societies. We spent an awful lot of money, but we took back between 6,000 and 7,000 kids. So the big question, both to you in the panel and since this is a Nordic conference, why don't we do that again? Why don't we, at least on a Nordic level, and here we have all the Nordic academics and countries together, why couldn't we as Nordics play together and take some responsibility? Not necessarily with Afghanistan, it could be quite difficult to get access, but there are other countries where we would have access, and we could do this in a decent way So, whereby also human rights are taken care of. It's about the return in dignity. Thank you.
Can we take another question now here and then let the panel go here?
Yeah, as I work for IOM and I have been for 25 years, I feel, and I'm a practitioner, I feel somehow I need to make a few comments. I'm afraid there's a bit of an academic tendency to focus on trees instead of the forest. I'm very happy that you did what you did, but I'm not sure whether it's comprehensive and large enough. I'm of course aware, because IOM is like a big family. I heard from your research, I'm in contact with the mission here, I work in the Netherlands now, and with the mission in Afghanistan, I developed developments. I'm not sure whether you looked at returnees from other countries to the same destination countries. What I can tell you, having worked in countries of origin 7 years before in Moldova, where people were returned to, in Armenia, in Kosovo, in Mozambique, and in the past 4 years I've been engaged very systematically in doing follow-up monitoring visits to Nepal, again to Kosovo, to Colombia, to Ghana, to Morocco, and I must tell you, I've never come across once the issue of trust. Now, the more interesting issue is that you came across cases or allegations of corruption, and the second related issue, of course, is the question of responsibility. I believe it's clearly our responsibility, or the service provider, and what's at stake is, of course, our reputation. In the Netherlands, IOM is not the only service providers, there's a lot of NGOs. I get particularly complaints from my Arabic-speaking counselors about NGOs not delivering on their promises in Iraq. I always tell them, please provide me the evidence so we can go back to the government, etc. Now, again, this issue of trust, I think maybe because that's how you started it, it's maybe a little bit exaggerated. For me, what counts is if the services or the promised integration wasn't delivered. And this is a big issue. To add to this, a big issue is the practice and the harmonization of the delivery of the reintegration grant. There's still huge questions. Presently, under pressure from populism, the issue of reintegration is no longer such a big issue as it used to be, despite the fact, even from a justice, home affairs, police point of view, it has clear advantages because it allows, particularly the kind of reintegration that we hope to try to provide, in-kind reintegration on top of the cash grants, provides for a period of readaptation, because particularly if you have been away for a long time, returning is quite a traumatic experience. You may no longer be, you may not know the people, you may be a bit disconnected, and you need that time in order not to reinvest the money in a new smuggling experience. So thank you very much for your research. I encourage you to do more, because there are some European harmonization attempts also to streamline the benefits. Not very successful, unfortunately, and it's a huge topic. On readmission, I've also worked, personally been involved, and again, it's a bit of a forest and tree question. Everything you said is correct. There is even a bit of a comparison with the trafficking protocol versus the smuggling protocol. Readmission clearly focuses on the state-to-state obligations, and it is sold as a panacea and as a silver bullet to solve problems. Far from it. In Moldova, the funny thing happened is, being a candidate to the EU, they were behaving perfectly, everything was going well, which, as you also mentioned, very often they are not needed because things bilaterally work very well. And then they came up with a complicated document which actually complicated things to the extent that now they can, by invoking certain paragraphs, they can complicate the return and re-acceptance process. I mentioned the forest. The forest, the thing which still isn't sufficiently put on the table on global level, at UN level, is the obligation, of course, of states, normal states, I'm not talking about North Korea here, to accept their citizens. And this message, for some reason, doesn't get enough support. So if that message were clear to all and sundry who want to be part of the civilized world and a globally interconnected world, then we wouldn't need these readmission agreements. Number one. Number two, another thing which has been signed and then thrown away, the smuggling protocol, Palermo Protocol against smuggling of migrants by land, air and sea. There, Article 18 is very clear that smuggled migrants, and everybody arriving at Lampedusa is smuggled, or on the Greek islands, or like almost some swim, but very few from Turkey. But everybody else is smuggled, meaning their illegal entry has been facilitated. There is, and Greece and Turkey and all civilized countries are signatories to that protocol. There's an obligation to help to identify your nationals and to take them back. So the instrument already exists, but typically it's not used or forgotten, or makulatur, as we say in German. Thank you. That was not a question, it was a comment.
Thank you very much. Erlend, do you want to start?
As you said, that was not a question. Did you have a question?
Well, we'll talk later.
All right.
What about the Nordic cooperation?
I don't have very intimate knowledge of the operation of return to Vietnam, so I don't know how much I can comment on that. I do think there's potential for Nordic collaboration in terms of return, both in terms of evaluating and monitoring assisted return, and potentially also in the long term for designing joint programs and implementing return directly. Already we know that there are some countries that do this, like the UK does it in Nigeria, for instance. It operates its own return program. France does it in Armenia. Germany does it in Kosovo. Now, I'm thinking this might be a long-term kind of prospect, but you could imagine that there is some potential for the Nordic governments to do something similar by pooling their efforts and funding. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important to also realize the reasons why states won't accept their own citizens. Because I mean, it's clear they should, but like for example in Ethiopia, remittances from refugees is one of the most important like income sources for Ethiopia. And if they accept suddenly everyone from Norway, then they perhaps feel that they have to accept every sort of all the migrants from Europe. That will be a problem not only to reintegrate them there, but economically for them. So it's like they have very sort of few incentives to sort of say to admit their own citizens, and that's also, I mean, it's a problem with this readmission agreements. And now it's part of the Sylvi Listhaus or the government sort of actions is to link readmission agreements with Norwegian aid, or to see if that can be done somehow. And why do they do that? That is, of course, because you can realize that it's difficult to negotiate a readmission agreement with a country that has no interest in readmitting their own citizens. You know, it's like, yes, we should, but how does it help us? But if Norway can say, yeah, you know, then maybe we can look into aid programs, for example, then that can be used as a leverage. And it's not decided, they're not doing that now necessarily, and it's not decided that they will, but this is something that they're looking into.
Just to the last point first, because also ideas about return migration in the countries of origin are also central to this. What kind of people are they receiving? The way Europeans talk about migrants that they reject, the people they would like countries to take back, are not spoken of very positively. So the people that we don't want, well, why would other countries want them? That's what we risk by framing migrants as a threat and framing migrants as problematic others. They might be seen so in the countries we would like to send them to as well. I studied the case of Nigeria, where in Europe many Nigerians are associated with organized crime in the form of trafficking, with other forms of crime, particularly drugs. And this is also an embarrassment to Nigeria. So there are also relationships to their citizens and willingness to return them needs to be seen in relation to how they're being framed. That particular group is being framed in Europe. So I'm just thinking that's also part of the bigger picture here. It's both the financial situation and the legal frameworks, but also how these people are seen both here and there.
Two questions, one here and then another one. And Jens first. And,
Thank you. Thanks for very interesting presentations. I have an observation which I could introduce by way of a question to you, Kristian. What could or should be done to those, you referred to some people who eventually, at least for the time being, will not be deported because of, you referred then to non-refoulement as a factor in play here. Mm-hmm. And now the observation. I would agree with Trygve and with the official policy position that there has to be returns in order to sort of maintain the, some would say the credibility, I would say the consistency of the asylum system. And it is also an important point for decision makers that you should only reject asylum seekers if you are certain that they can return or be deported without risk of ill treatment or persecution. But then that has also a reverse logic, of course. If you dare not return them, and even refer to non-refoulement or related considerations, shouldn't then their asylum case be reopened and reconsidered? And this is, I think, fairly practical. It may touch upon issues close to temporary protection. In Denmark, in fact, for a while, between 2011 and 2013, we had a kind of unofficial and, in my view, unlawful temporary protection or tolerated status for certain Syrian asylum seekers who had not been accepted as refugees, neither as beneficiaries of subsidiary protection, but nonetheless the appeals board was not prepared to say they could be deported, actually referring to the non-refoulement clause in the Aliens Act. And that was, in my view, I mean, it was unlawful, simply, formally speaking, but it was also a very unsustainable position to say, you don't really fall under our criteria, but on the other hand, we're not sure you can be deported. That's a limbo which is, in my view, also not tenable.
Can we take another question here before?
My name is Anne Lacour. I'm head of the Asylum Department of the Red Cross. And I would like to share a bit of some practical experiences with you. And it is linked to what you said, Trygve. Because we are running 20 asylum centers in Denmark, and the rest of the asylum centers are run by the municipalities. And for the last 3 years, we have been carrying out a return counseling in the centers, and it's paid for by the state. And we have very good experiences with that. And the reason that we involved ourselves in it was that we saw people sitting for years and years and years in the centers, and nobody even talked to them. And it was not our task to involve in the asylum cases. They had a final rejection, and we, from the Red Cross point of view, as a starting point, if people have been rejected, they should return. And then, of course, there could be some cases where that has to be looked at again in the refugee board. And if we find cases like that, we immediately refer to some lawyers to look into these cases again. But otherwise, the fact that the rejected asylum seekers, they know the staff. They have trust and confidence in the staff. It's much easier for us to carry out these counseling sessions. And it's not only one session, it could be more, it could be up to 5 different sessions. And sometimes it seems that there are, the reasons that they could not return is actually able to overcome. I mean, there could be very small problems actually. Like one boy who didn't want. He was ashamed to return, and he was afraid that he would be. It was very embarrassing from him. And then he called his mother, and she was so happy by the fact that he would return. So but we have very good experiences with that, and the Danish Refugee Council, they are doing the same counseling in the centers run by the municipalities. So thank you.
Now there's one question behind, but when the microphone is being up there, maybe we give you answer to these 2 questions now.
Sure.
Yep.
No, I agree that I think all of the aspects of the migration policy is in many ways unsustainable, right? It's not sustainable, the system itself, or you could say that people crossing the Mediterranean and drowning, that's not a sustainable system. And also having people sort of without legal residence that you're not able to return is also, in a sense, not sustainable. And then the question is what to do about it. And I mean, it's one report estimated that in Norway it's somewhere between 15 and 40,000 people living without legal residence in Norway. I mean, it's very difficult to measure, right? Some of them are asylum seekers, some of them are not, and many of them have been here for a very long time. And of course, you have to. I agree that it's too little focus on sort of what to do about them. You sort of just say that we're going to return them, we are going to return them, and no matter how difficult it is, and no matter if you waited 10, 15 years, we hope we'll return them. It's a bit, I don't know if this is a far-fetched comparison, but it's a bit like the labor market policy, right? We say to people, you have to get a job, no matter how sort of disabled you are. We're putting everyone through the same sort of system that, arbeidslinjen, the sort of, everyone has to work. But then eventually you say, okay, perhaps not, and they get uføretrygd, like they get the living wage without, we sort of accept that you're outside the labor market. So I don't know. You could imagine a similar system saying that, yeah, okay, if we're not able to return you in 15 years, then perhaps we have to do something about it and let you stay. But it's a touchy political topic. So.
Well, I think the Red Cross is quite correct in offering those services and that assistance. I mean, it's a touchy, kind of politically controversial issue as well. Some would say that no, as a humanitarian organization, you shouldn't be involved in migration management. I think maybe because I've talked with a lot of people who have spent years and years, like maybe more than a decade in Norway, as rejected asylum seekers, as irregular migrants, or just like waiting for their case to be closed. And I've seen them like after return to the country of origin, and for me, that's just like, it's very apparent the high cost of not having an efficient return policy as well. So it's I see this as a kind of gray zone with a lot of dilemmas, a lot of tensions, but I think it's good that the Red Cross offers those services, and it's also, of course, like one of the things that both makes Red Cross an effective partner. And that makes the whole thing delicate is the trust and the kind of name recognition that Red Cross has. So it goes directly into the issue of trust as well. Yeah.
Just want to have a short comment to Trygve Nordby, because he mentioned, I think it was you who mentioned earlier, the state of exception. The idea that it is getting worse and worse and more, and how we fit into this establishment of the current predicament as a state of exception. But in the same vein, that is also something that opens up the possibility for exceptional solutions. So this is also what is needed if we are to say, okay, let's everything we have decided, just throw it aside, we'll make something new. We'll forge new collaborations, and we'll do something else. That is also dependent on a sense of a state of exception. So I think that points to the doubleness that you pointed to, that it has pros and it has benefits and costs to establish the current as very special.
Okay, thank you. Now there's a final question from the audience.
I want to thank you, Kristian, for making us aware of that return is not as big as we think. Though in the context of low recognition rate, there is a huge number of people who, or this case is going to continue to be a special focus for Europe. And therefore, I'm wondering, why didn't any of you touch the whole idea of Europe taking up a return as a major focus with all these partnership agreement frameworks, and the recent deal with Afghanistan to the extent of including building a terminal for flights with returnees. So I wonder if some one of you would make a reflection on that. And my last point is, as you have studied the return cases, I wonder what kind of role IOM plays in this. Whose interest is IOM always living up to? This could apply for UNHCR as well. whom do they put in the center when it comes to, I mean, who finances these institutions and whose interest comes first? So maybe an honest reflection. I do hope that will come from this. Thank you.
Would like to start?
Yeah, I think I'll just say that it's my point was not to be sort of, I'm not against readmission agreements, right? I don't see a problem per se that the Norwegian governments or the EU enter into agreement with a country that facilitates return, because I think we all here agree that sort of return needs to be somehow a component of migration policy. But then the question is, how do you do it, and doing it with humane standards and everything like that. But it's nothing like to enter into a readmission agreement can be a good idea. I just think it's important that we're honest about what the readmission agreements can do and what they can't.
Erlend, would you still like to?
You asked for a few reflections on the IOM and kind of nature of the IOM. I mean, you could fill him in afterwards. I think IOM is a kind of, it fills a vacuum, or it fills a desperate need in today's world for managing migration. It's, we heard earlier today about the kind of the emergence of a paradigm shift that I partly agree with, that migration management as it looks today is no longer sustainable. There has to be changes, there have to be kind of reforms and revisions. And the IOM represents a great deal of kind of technocratic knowledge of migration. I mean, it's one of the actors that has specialized in migration worldwide. I think that gives them a competitive edge vis-a-vis other organizations. But it also makes them a little immune to, or it makes maybe the partnering states, or those states that engage in partnerships with the IOM, reluctant to monitor, reluctant to take those discussions about, you know, what exactly is the nature of the services, how can you guarantee that you fulfill your roles. Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword. Yeah.
To that particular point, I think it's also important to notice that IOM is not only one big happy family. There are great diversity within the IOM as an organization. So what is, and this is some of the also challenges for IOM as it negotiates deals where there is IOM in a host state and IOM in a receiving end. And there is lots of complicated organizations taking place in this to make sure that what is happening is in accord with IOM internationally on an overarching level. So I think that the complexity of such a large, and UN was mentioned at the same time, the large international organizations has a particular position in our time as also something that competes with states. It's setting its mark on how migration is met. And one can find very kind of diverse statements and outcomes of that if one looks at IOM, for example, exactly because it's enormous and has different strands and not necessarily operating in the same way every places. So I think both UN and IOM are such big organizations, so it becomes problematic to think of it as one thing. So I think that acknowledging the diversity in those kinds of institutions, like also on national level, to look more locally on what is happening, is kind of one way of understanding what that actually means, what these multinational institutions actually means and do.
Okay, thank you very much for the panel and for the lively question from the persons from the audience. So we will finish here.
Fargene blir stadig bedre. Ja, det